Welcome to Cinemophile, where we bring you the best in independent, documentary, and foreign films, and we talk to the people who made them. I'm your host, Mike Caspar, and you can find out more about the program by going to cinemophilepod.com. Homegrown brings raw intimacy and unprecedented access to a political movement that is still unfolding. Shot across battleground communities and key flashpoints of national tension, the documentary reveals the lived experience of people whose determination to turn their beliefs into action places them on the front lines of America's political divide. It does that and so much more. It's a terrific documentary film called Homegrown. We're joined today by the director, Michael Premo. Michael, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to keep talking to you.
Yeah, this is great. I'm glad we're having an ongoing conversation about this because as someone who grew up as an adult in the world of politics and deeply invested in it, I think what you've done here is you've taken away a lot of the stereotypes, allowed us to see these people as people that we would relate to in some ways, and also a continuation of the story from our initial conversation, which I think is invaluable to our political discourse and an understanding of the world we live in. Tell me a little bit about the origin story for Homegrown.
So we started this film, the idea of it started sort of really coming together in 2016, 2017. I was really surprised at the surprise around how surprised people seemed to be about the rise of Donald Trump. And we could see that there was something bubbling in this country that seemed like it could be cataclysmic in some way. We, of course, could never have seen where it necessarily went, but things were building. And so we wanted to spend time with people to better understand what they were fighting for and why they were fighting. And we were increasingly interested in people who were critical of democracy, who were feeling like democracy maybe was an inadequate situation or an inadequate solution to organizing society, which seems like just like a radical departure from the consensus around liberal democracy and what it can offer to average individuals. And so that really inspired us to kind of set up on this path to understand and why people were feeling like maybe violence was the only solution to their problem.
Again, as I said in the introduction, it breaks down some of these stereotypes because we get to know these people. We get to know people like Chris and Thad, Randy and Jakari and others in the film that are people that we would share a lunch with. There's a lot more of what they say breaks down some stereotypes about the kind of people that we have been basically used to seeing on kind of a hyper sensationalized way throughout the media in many different venues and platforms across the country. And breaking down the stereotypes, I think, is a really important part of this film.
One of the obstacles that is preventing us from addressing this sort of widening partisan divide, I think this is a human instinct in some ways where in order to separate ourselves from people that we disagree with, we sort of reduce people into these stereotypes or these characters that help distinguish them from us. And even this idea of them and us, and not a more dynamic, fluid understanding of our interrelated and interconnected realities, people sort of create these stereotypes to separate ourselves. And we really wanted to just understand who these people are on a human level. And what we discovered, I think, was really fascinating and I think really, in some ways, revelatory for our discussion right now, because we found people who weren't necessarily driven by ideology or policy or many of these big ideas that often the debate is framed around. What we found was people who are looking for community, looking for purpose, looking for meaning, and trying to sort of have something to hold on to in an unstable and uncertain world.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely accurate. And if you just want to look at the last 20 years of American history, 25 years since in this century, the American public has been whipsawed by economic distress in ways that are hard to fathom, would have been hard to fathom in 1999. Loss of opportunities for jobs, good paying jobs, basically being put out of work by technology, all kinds of things that have happened in betrayal of the American ideals that they were sold when they were kids growing up. This is your dream. If you work hard, you put in the time, you build a family, these are the things that you can expect. And they haven't turned out to be true. So I understand the frustration, and it's easy to see why these people and how relatable they are in this film to that idea.
That's right.
What, I mean, again, as you were moving through this process of filming Homegrown, what was your reaction as you're meeting with people? And I want to make sure Enrique Tarrio, who is the head of Proud Boys, is also in the film. So, well, how did this break down some of your own perceptions or misconceptions, if you will?
I mean, I think one of the big things was what I mentioned was the sort of ideology.
Yeah.
I was really intrigued to find people just looking for purpose. I think that was one piece of it. Another piece of it, particularly when you talk about Enrique, was the increasing multicultural participation in these
Yeah.
conservative spaces was really surprising to me.
Yeah.
It was not something I anticipated before going into the film, and it was really important to us to be able to include that sort of storyline because it's something that is under discussed, particularly in liberal media.
I want to make sure people have an opportunity to know where they can go to watch Homegrown. So let's talk. I want to get into more of the substance, but I want to make sure people know they can see Homegrown how.
Homegrown will be available to rent at home on your computer or on your smart TV starting January 6th if you go to homegrown.film, and it'll be available on homegrown.film from January 6th to President's Day.
Fantastic. And we had a conversation with the first iteration of Homegrown, which was utterly fascinating. You can check it out on our website. But also, you've added some footage, which I really believe in the way that you did it really enhances everything about this work. And that is, go ahead, tell us how things morphed into what we see in this version of Homegrown.
So we premiered the Venice Film Festival in 2024. A couple months later, as everyone knows, President Trump was reelected. One of his first things to do in office was to pardon the 1,800 people who were charged in connection to their participation in January 6th. One of those people is in our film. And so it was a no-brainer that we would go back and sort of understand where he is now. He had spent about 4 years in jail over the course of waiting for trial and then eventually being convicted. We wanted to see where he was at, and so we included that in the film. In many ways, it's a better film, like you said, and it's really affirming to hear you say that because we think it just sort of like wraps up sort of his arc and his trajectory of who he is now and how he defines himself.
It may be too much of a question for for a relatively short answer, but are you optimistic, more optimistic, less optimistic about the future of discourse in this country, a future that is devoid of political violence, or at least, how do you feel in terms of the landscape we're moving into now? And I say this in the context of a diminishing Donald Trump as president of the United States. There'll be a scramble for succession. I'm assuming a lot of things in this question, but I think we can see the end of MAGA as a Donald Trump movement. How do you feel moving forward in terms of political violence and discourse in this country?
Well, I'll preface it by the hope. I feel like I think the important thing that we hope to make clear in this film is that people are motivated by these fundamental human need to be understood, to have understanding, and to have some stability in their life. And if we can sort of like approach our partisan dialogues and debates and disagreements around that lens, I think it gives us an invitation to reapproach those debates. And I say that to preface perhaps the less hopeful outlook, which is I feel like we're at a point in this country where the violence is only going to escalate. We have this situation when you look at the national level where you have two political parties which don't really see the other as a legitimate partner in governance. And that is not a good sign for how we move through this sort of gridlock. What we experienced over the course of making this film was sectarian violence. But we don't talk about sectarian violence in this country. That's a word we often use when we're talking about Iraq or, foreign countries. But we have a situation where we have people who are sort of on opposite sides and are driven by what they see as sort of like these sort of entrenched perspectives that no longer sees anyone else who might not agree with them as a co-equal member of the same society. We hear this rhetoric coming from the president that, these people hate America, and from the other side saying, well, these people are this, and third. I think is a call to action for anybody committed to the promises of a multiracial democracy to be able to sort of try to address these sort of underlying tensions that are driving us towards increased sectarian violence.
And I'll add an even less optimistic perspective on all this. And as we are entering the dawning of an age that promises to be disruptive on many different levels with the rising integration of AI into our society and around the world, the surveillance society of word I'm hearing now, surveillance capitalism is moving into spaces now, and which will be disruptive. And for people who are on the outside looking in, the opportunity and the truth of being left behind is even going to become even more pressing for a lot of people. So this is a cautionary tale. Check out Homegrown. It's a wonderful documentary film. It gives a really fulsome perspective on where we've been, where we are, and where we could be going. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Michael Premo, thank you so very much for your time today here on Cinemaphile.
Thank you so much, Mike. I always enjoy our conversations and your insightful questions.
You have been listening to Cinemaphile with Mike Kaspar, the place where you will hear from the best in independent documentary and foreign filmmakers. Please check out our previous interviews as well as upcoming interviews and special programming by going to cinemaphilepod.com. We are also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, searchable under Cinemaphile with Mike Kaspar. Until next time, thank you for listening.